a resource-rich region suddenly shifted direction. Within months, a territory holding uranium, lithium, gold, and manganese faced rising instability while outside powers recalculated strategies. Why does Ibrahim Traore now matter to global observers watching Ibrahim Traoré Burkina Faso developments? Because the next phase could redraw alliances. You are about to hear something most discussions avoid saying openly. You will grasp the real strategic landscape behind Sahel tensions. This is not casual information. Ignoring what follows often leads analysts to misread events. Assume surface explanations are enough, and miss deeper forces already shaping outcomes. Some observers rely only on headlines and therefore misjudge motives, timing, and consequences. Others recognize too late that decisions were never isolated incidents but parts of broader geopolitical shifts. Missing this perspective means losing the ability to anticipate what comes next, while understanding it provides a rare strategic advantage. You have now reached the point where stepping away risks misunderstanding the entire situation. What many suspected is true: the Sahel crisis is not driven by one cause but by converging pressures. More than 400 million people across West Africa, indirectly tied to its stability, which means even localized shocks can ripple outward fast. Ibrahim Traore appears in this landscape not simply as a national leader, but as a figure emerging at a structural fault line where security, resources, and geopolitics intersect. Before tensions intensified, the region already carried layered fragilities. Several Sahel states possess major deposits of uranium, lithium, gold, and manganese, minerals considered strategically critical in global supply chains. Yet despite that geological wealth, large portions of their populations remain economically vulnerable, creating a sharp contrast between national resource value and everyday living conditions. Instability did not escalate overnight. First came persistent armed threats and cross-border militant activity that national forces struggled to contain alone. Then came policy disagreements between governments and foreign partners about how to handle those threats. Some external actors emphasized military solutions, while local perspectives increasingly stressed governance, development, and livelihoods as equally urgent priorities. A brief example illustrates the shift. In one Sahel corridor, local authorities reportedly found that laws designed to stop migration punished transit regions more than origin countries, fueling resentment rather than cooperation. Small policy details like that often go unnoticed internationally, yet they can reshape alliances quietly. The earliest groups to feel the strain were not foreign governments or corporations, but ordinary communities facing insecurity, limited services, and shrinking economic options. When daily survival competes with political ideals, populations tend to prioritize stability first. That reality explains why external narratives about democracy or ideology sometimes resonate less strongly on the ground than practical concerns such as food access, safety, and jobs. Seen through that lens, Ibrahim Traoré's rise aligns with a broader regional pattern rather than an isolated political episode. The situation was never a single crisis. It was a chain reaction waiting for a trigger. Observers searching for a reliable guide to interpret these shifts often point to institutional voices closely involved in regional security dialogue. Among them are senior West African officials who have dealt directly with cross-border threats and diplomatic coordination. Their credibility comes not from rhetoric, but from operational experience managing crises that spill across national boundaries. Through that lens, Ibrahim Traore is less an anomaly and more a signal within a wider regional recalibration. One official described the Sahel situation as a convergence crisis, meaning several pressures collide at once rather than unfold separately. That framing matters because it reframes events from isolated incidents into interacting forces. Political disagreements, economic stress, and climate factors do not occur sequentially. When one intensifies, the others often follow. A short illustration clarifies the pattern. In border regions where state authority is thin, mobility increases for armed groups and smuggling networks. Increased mobility then weakens confidence in government presence, encourages recruitment into non-state groups promising protection or income. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Another example emerged from diplomatic engagement attempts. Some European representatives acknowledged that earlier external strategies relied too heavily on military training while under-investing in governance and development. That imbalance sometimes produced unintended consequences, including instability inside partner states, when local populations saw security forces strengthened but social conditions unchanged. Trust eroded instead of improving. These early signals convinced many analysts that the situation was not a temporary disturbance. It was structural. Reversing them requires more than tactical adjustments. It requires rethinking relationships, priorities, and expectations on all sides. From that moment forward, the story stopped being about a single country. It became about a region entering a different phase. Everything accelerated after the turning point. Before, tensions simmered. After, they moved fast. Ibrahim Traoré entered headlines as reactions stacked rapidly across the region. The trigger phase came first. A political shift. Statements hardened. Alliances questioned. Regional bodies reassessed positions. External partners recalculated interests. Nothing exploded publicly. Yet the tempo changed overnight. Then the escalation phase began. Diplomatic signals intensified. Security concerns multiplied. Foreign policy debates sharpened. Narratives competed. Trust thinned. Every move invited interpretation. Every interpretation triggered another move. At the same time, multiple actors stepped in with proposals, strategies, or warnings. Some emphasized counterterrorism cooperation. Others stressed development and governance reforms. A few warned that treating the crisis only as a military problem had already failed in the past. Each perspective pulled policy in a slightly different direction, and that divergence itself became part of the tension. Momentum spread beyond borders. Neighboring states watched closely. Regional organizations weighed responses. International partners evaluated risks. Markets tracked stability indicators. Analysts compared scenarios. No one assumed the situation was local anymore. The aftershock phase followed quietly but heavily. The most visible effects appeared not in conference halls but in long-term calculations. Governments began reassessing security doctrines. Diplomatic envoys intensified visits. Strategic planners started mapping new partnership routes. Once such planning begins, it signals expectation of prolonged change rather than short disruption. Communities closest to fragile zones felt the weight first. When authority is uneven across territory, daily life becomes unpredictable. Trade routes and local economies. Over time, those shifts reshape national priorities. Structural change rarely announces itself loudly. It accumulates silently until its consequences are unmistakable. What started as a sequence of events was becoming a trajectory. Once established, tend to continue unless something powerful intervenes. Numbers change how a situation feels. They replace impressions with scale. They show whether concern is symbolic or structural. Across West Africa, more than 400 million citizens lived within the broader regional system affected by Sahel stability dynamics. That figure indicates the potential reach of consequences beyond any single border. A disturbance in one zone can influence migration flows, trade routes, and security calculations across an enormous population base. Consider age distribution. In several central Sahel countries, the median age is under 16, while Burkina Faso's median age is about 18.8. That statistic signals a demographic structure dominated by youth. A population that young means economic opportunity, education access, and employment capacity become decisive factors in stability. Because large youth cohorts amplify both potential growth and potential unrest depending on conditions. Now look at the structural dimension. The region holds significant deposits of uranium, lithium, gold, and manganese, minerals frequently listed among globally critical resources. That fact indicates that economic stakes extend far beyond local markets. Because these materials are tied to energy systems, technology production, and industrial supply chains worldwide. These three data points together reshape the narrative. A vast population base, an extremely young demographic profile, and globally strategic mineral reserves create a combination rarely found in one geographic corridor. Policy decisions in that environment can influence not just national trajectories but international calculations. This is why analysts tracking Ibrahim Traoré Burkina Faso developments often shift from political commentary to structural analysis. They are not only watching a leader. And when variables align at this scale, the weight of events increases dramatically. This is no longer just a news topic. It is a measurable reality pressing outward. Some observers genuinely interpret the situation differently, and their perspective deserves careful attention. They argue that external involvement in the Sahel has often been necessary because regional threats, especially armed extremist networks, rarely stop at borders. From this viewpoint, international security partnerships were not interference but assistance requested under urgent conditions. Funding and intelligence support, they contend several governments might have struggled even more to maintain territorial control. That argument carries weight when examined closely. Cross-border militant activity does require coordination beyond one nation's capacity, and multinational initiatives have at times reduced violence in specific zones. Yet the limitation of this perspective appears when outcomes are compared over time. Despite years of security-first strategies, instability persisted in multiple areas, suggesting that military support alone could not resolve deeper structural drivers such as governance gaps, economic inequality, and weak infrastructure. Security tools can suppress symptoms, they rarely cure root causes by themselves. A second strong counterposition focuses on geopolitics rather than policy design. According to this view, global powers are primarily motivated by competition with rivals, not by local conditions, resources, or strategic positioning. In that interpretation, shifts involving figures like Ibrahim Traoré are seen less as domestic political developments, and more as moves within a wider context among external actors. This perspective also contains truth. Major powers do calculate interests, and strategic minerals or trade routes undeniably shape foreign policy priorities. Treating geopolitics as the only explanation risks oversimplifying a complex environment. Local agency still matters. Regional leaders, civil institutions, and populations make decisions that cannot be reduced solely to outside pressure. Ignoring that internal dimension leads to incomplete analysis. When both viewpoints are placed side by side, a clearer picture forms. External forces influence events. Internal dynamics shape outcomes. Neither alone explains the trajectory. Understanding emerges only when both are considered together, revealing a reality more layered than either side initially suggests. Then everything shifted again. A quiet realization surfaced inside diplomatic circles. The crisis was no longer being treated as a purely military problem. Several officials openly acknowledged that force alone could not stabilize the Sahel, a shift that subtly altered strategic planning across multiple governments. Policies built on security-first assumptions suddenly looked incomplete. This is where Ibrahim Traoré enters the equation in a different light. Instead of being viewed only as a political actor, he began to represent a test case for whether new approaches could replace older intervention models. That distinction matters because strategies toward Ibrahim Traoré Burkina Faso are now being discussed alongside broader reforms, not just tactical responses. At nearly the same time, a new European diplomatic approach was outlined with 3 pillars. Deeper political dialogue, expanded human security measures, and long-term socio-economic resilience. Each pillar signaled recognition that earlier methods had missed key drivers of instability. The implication was subtle but powerful. If policy changes, alliances may change too. From that point onward, every development carried added weight. What once looked like isolated regional turbulence started resembling the early stage of systemic realignment. And if that interpretation proves correct, what comes next will not resemble what came before. The consequences did not stay confined to policy rooms. They began appearing in tangible layers of reality, moving outward from strategy into daily life. At the government level, pressure intensified quickly. Authorities across the region faced simultaneous demands: restore security, maintain legitimacy. manage foreign relations, and stabilize economies. Each decision carried trade-offs. Choosing one partner risked alienating another. Adjusting one policy could trigger reactions across borders. In that environment, leadership was no longer judged only by domestic results, but by how effectively it navigated external expectations. Ibrahim Traoré's position therefore became part of a broader test of state resilience rather than a purely national political question. Businesses felt the shift next. Investors monitor stability indicators closely, and even the perception of volatility can delay projects or redirect capital. Transport corridors and agricultural distribution depend heavily on predictability. When uncertainty rises, companies slow commitments, reassess partnerships, or demand stronger guarantees. That hesitation alone can influence employment levels and local economic momentum. But two forecasts of events. For ordinary citizens, the impact is more immediate. Security concerns affect travel, schooling, healthcare access, and prices of basic goods. When instability disrupts transport routes, food costs can rise. When public resources divert toward defense, social programs may tighten. Yet they experience their consequences daily through work opportunities, safety conditions, and access to services. This is where abstract policy becomes lived reality. Regionally, neighboring states watch closely because instability rarely respects borders. Movement of armed groups, migration flows, and trade disruptions can spread effects outward. Regional organizations must then coordinate responses, balancing diplomacy with security planning. A localized crisis thus becomes a shared regional calculation. The result is a layered chain reaction. Governments adjust, markets react, neighboring countries respond. Once those layers activate simultaneously, the situation stops being a contained issue. It becomes a system-wide shift whose influence touches nearly everyone connected to the region. From this point, analysts usually outline three plausible paths forward, each grounded in patterns already visible rather than speculation. The most likely trajectory is gradual tension with intermittent stabilization. Under this scenario, regional governments continue adjusting policies while external partners recalibrate their engagement strategies. Security conditions fluctuate but do not collapse, and diplomatic channels remain active even when disagreements persist. Progress would be uneven, with short periods of improvement followed by renewed strain. This outcome tends to occur when competing interests balance each other without any single force dominating. A more optimistic outcome depends on alignment of priorities. If regional authorities, neighboring states, and international partners manage to coordinate development, governance, and security policies simultaneously, underlying pressures could ease. Expanded infrastructure, employment initiatives, and local governance reforms would reduce recruitment incentives for armed groups and strengthen public trust. In such a scenario, figures like Ibrahim Traoré would be judged less by crisis management and more by long-term institution building, signaling a transition from reaction to stability. The most serious risks in Ario emerges if miscalculations accumulate. Should cooperation break down, external rivalries intensify, or internal reforms stall, tensions could widen across borders. That would increase displacement, strain economies, and force governments into defensive postures that limit development efforts. Once instability spreads regionally, reversing it becomes far more difficult because each country must then manage both domestic and cross-border pressures at the same time. The key insight is not predicting which path will occur, it is recognizing that all three remain possible right now. Strategic awareness matters more than certainty, because conditions are still evolving and decisions made today will influence which direction becomes reality tomorrow. After seeing the broader landscape, the most important question becomes personal. What does all of this actually mean for someone watching from afar, trying to understand why developments in a distant region matter at all? For those who actively follow global affairs, this moment offers both opportunity and responsibility. Their advantage is awareness. They can see patterns forming earlier than most and recognize signals before they become headlines. But that advantage only holds if they stay attentive to reliable information and remain cautious about narratives that simplify complex realities. Rapid geopolitical shifts, reward observers who track details, not just conclusions. For people affected indirectly, the connection may be less obvious yet still real. Commodity prices, migration patterns, and international policy decisions often originate in regions many assume are unrelated to their lives. When stability shifts in a strategically important corridor, ripple effects can influence markets, trade routes, and diplomatic relations far beyond it. Understanding those links reduces uncertainty and helps individuals anticipate broader trends rather than reacting to them after the fact. There is also a third group, those who feel detached and assume events like this have no relevance to them. That distance can be misleading. Global systems are increasingly interconnected, and developments in one region frequently shape conditions elsewhere months or years later. Choosing not to pay attention does not prevent impact, no matter which group someone belongs to. Understanding the dynamics surrounding figures such as Ibrahim Traoré ultimately provides something valuable: context. And context is what allows people to interpret change instead of being surprised by it. There was a moment when experienced regional officials described the situation as a convergence crisis, a phrase that captured more than analysis. It captured an image: multiple forces pressing from different directions at once, each invisible on its own, yet unmistakable when felt together. At the beginning, the discussion centered on scattered tensions and isolated decisions. Step by step, those fragments connected into a pattern involving demographics, resources, security pressures, and geopolitical recalculation. What once looked like disconnected headlines gradually revealed itself as a single evolving structure. Following that path has shown how quickly assumptions can dissolve when events are viewed through a wider lens. Seen from this vantage point, Ibrahim Traoré is no longer just a name appearing in Ibrahim Traoré interview discussions or Burkina Faso news cycles. He becomes part of a broader narrative about generational change, regional strategy, and the shifting balance between internal priorities and external influence. The significance lies less in one individual and more in what his moment represents within a transforming environment. There is a quiet weight in recognizing that transformation, while it is still unfolding, history often feels obvious only in retrospect. Living through it rarely does, yet understanding the forces at work now gives observers a rare chance to witness not just events, but turning points. Some moments report history, others become it. From here, the choice of direction will not belong to one leader alone. Each listener has likely formed a different impression. Some may see this story as a warning about how fragile regional stability can be. Others may see it as evidence that global dynamics are shifting faster than expected. And some may simply see it as a reminder that understanding the world requires patience as much as curiosity. If this perspective felt worth exploring, it may also be worth letting others encounter it and weigh it for themselves. Conversations that spread insight often begin quietly, with one person deciding that a complex issue deserves more than a passing glance. Shared understanding grows that way, not through pressure, but through thoughtful exchange. So one question remains open, not as a test but as an invitation to reflect. When you look at everything unfolding, what do you think is the single most important factor that will shape what happens next? Whatever your answer, you are not alone in asking it.